And we're going to look at those populations of adults inside two settings, one in the use of technology and one in employment. So we're going to start with Saida Mamedova, from Senior Research Analyst from AIR, and Emily Pawlowski, a Research Associate from AIR, who will be talking about their paper, Who is Not Digitally Literate in the United States? I think this is a really important question to think about right now for us in the US as we're getting ready for Census 2020, which is going to use an internet-first response protocol. And when we think about hard-to-count populations and what this will mean to people without digital literacy, I think it's really a critical topic of research and discussion. And then our second paper, this will be Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, Director of Upskilling at the National Skills Coalition, and her co-author, Jasmine Park, a senior researcher at AIR, who's making things work behind the scenes over here. And this paper is Service Sector Worker Skills, Findings from PIAAC and Implications for Educators. And I'll just say, I think this paper is a, I'm almost done, is a really elegant example of marrying research and policy advocacy, and the brief was the basis for a Hill briefing done earlier this year that was very powerful. And then our discussant was Lisa Hudson, an education statistician from the National Center for Education Statistics at the U.S. Department of Ed.
Hi, everyone. The project that Emily and I did, it was a project for National Center for Education Statistics, and it resulted in a small short paper in their Statistics in Brief series, which is on NCS PIAAC website. It started as an intention to learn more about the adults that have low digital literacy. So on one hand, as we heard today, GED has become exclusively computer-based since 2014. Retail sales online are hundreds of billions of dollars. More than 80% of federal tax returns are filed online. And more than half of the internet users, study reports say that internet helps them to maintain social relationships. On the other hand, there is a disconnect, right? About a quarter of US household population are not connected to the internet, and there are certain characteristics of individuals that tend to make them more vulnerable to not having internet connected anywhere, so not at home, at work, etc. And that's individuals who are older, Black or Hispanic, having lower income and lower education. And so here's where PIAAC comes in. It's a, as you've heard, it's the first large-scale international literacy survey to assess adults' digital problem-solving skills. We're using data from the first administration of PIAAC in 2011-12. 19 of the 24 countries have opted into having the digital problem-solving skills assessment, and as you've heard, it consists of a rich background questionnaire and both literacy and numeracy assessments, as well as the digital problem-solving assessment. And what is defined, the domain is defined reflecting an ability to interact effectively with digital information to solve problems. And they do that by simulating the environments, so sorting through emails, finding information on a website, or working with a spreadsheet. So this we have two research objectives: is to provide a profile of U.S. adults with low digital literacy, and then provide an international context to it and the use of technology. So for those of you who were here on Wednesday and maybe a little bit yesterday, we talked about who are the people who did not take computer-based assessment. So this is a presentation for you to learn about them. But this is identical to our definition of adults with low digital literacy. So before a respondent would take the assessment on the computer, they had to pass these three screening criteria. They had to report prior computer use, they had to be willing to take the assessment on the computer, and then they also had to pass a very basic test of highlighting and using the mouse. In the US, 16% of US population did not meet that criteria, so we're taking a look at the 16% or the 32 million U.S. adults who didn't meet this criteria, and we call the people who took the digital literacy as digital illiterate. Of course, we don't mean it in a way that they have high digital literacy. It's just they had at least enough comfort with computers to do the test on the computer. So now Emily will go over the profile.
Thank you, Saida. So looking at the profile of these U.S. adults with low digital literacy, first we looked at their educational attainment, and we found that the percentage of those without a high school degree was higher among the not digitally literate group than in the digitally literate group. So over 1/3 of the not digitally literate population had less than high school education, while only 1 in 10 of the digitally literate group did. Next, we looked at gender, and we saw that the percentage of not digitally literate adults who are men is higher than in the digitally literate group. Looking at nativity, we found that the percentage of foreign-born adults is higher in the not digitally literate group compared to the digitally literate group. So almost 1/3 of the not digitally literate group were foreign-born, compared to only about 1 in 10 of the native-born group. We also looked at age, and we saw that the percentage of those who are 45 years old or older is higher in the not digitally literate group compared to the digitally literate group. So almost over 60% of the not digitally literate adults were in that older age groups, compared to around 40% of the digitally literate adults. Looking at race ethnicity, we saw that the percentages of Hispanic and Black adults are higher among the not digitally literate group compared to the digitally literate group. Next, we looked at their cognitive skills in the literacy and numeracy assessment, and we saw that the not digitally literate adults had significantly lower literacy and numeracy scores than the digitally literate adults. So literacy scores and numeracy scores. So we also looked at some of their workforce characteristics. So in terms of labor force participation, the not digitally literate adults had a lower rate of labor force participation than digitally literate adults. But when they are in the labor force, their employment rates are similar between the digitally literate and not digitally literate. In terms of occupation, there was a higher percentage of not digitally literate adults working in unskilled or semi-skilled blue-collar occupations compared to the digitally literate group. Next, Saida will go over some of the international comparisons on the digital literacy and use of technology.
So how did U.S. do internationally? And for once, we're doing relatively well in terms of international comparison. We have lower rate of low digitally literate adults than the international average. And when if we look at the countries that are doing even better than us, so the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, we see that the same countries have the highest percentage of adults using computer in everyday life. It may not be a surprising thing, but the interesting thing is that on the other hand, Japan, Poland, and Slovak Republic they had 37, 50, and 36% respectively of percentages of adults with low digital literacy. So they had the highest proportions of not digitally literate adults. They have some of the lowest percentages of adults using computers in everyday life. US is somewhere in the middle compared to the international average. We have a bit of higher percentage of computer use at work and a bit lower percentage use of computers in everyday life. And so in summary, we can say that low digitally literate adults in the US tend to be less educated, male, 45 years old or older, Black or Hispanic. They tend to have lower skills, both in literacy and numeracy. They have lower labor force participation, and even when they do work, they tend to work in lower skilled jobs. In the US, there's a smaller proportion of adults with low digital literacy compared to the international average. And there is a negative relationship between percentage of adults using computer in everyday life and the percentage of low digitally literate adults. Some of the implications of this, of course, when you see the profile, you have to imagine that the interventions need to be a bit more targeted, right? And these are some of the things that we thought that could change that. For example, the fact that there are a lot more older adults, perhaps in the later stages of their working years, the digital literacy courses and offerings and curricula need to be adjusted to that. The digital literacy also can be incorporated in the basic skills interventions, given the low skills of adults who are also lacking digital literacy, and more funding for those not in the workforce is needed with the aim of improving digital literacy in everyday life. Also, given our sort of macro analysis, international analysis, focus on increasing use, proficiency, and access with technology in everyday life will be probably useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm Amanda Bergson-Shilcock with National Skills Coalition, and delighted to be here with all of you. If you're wondering why I had two nameplates at my seat, it's because I really wanted to explicitly acknowledge my co-author and partner in this project, Jasmine Park, who decided to play a behind-the-scenes role, or semi-behind-the-scenes role, in this afternoon's presentation, as well as Katie and Jale and everybody else at AIR that worked with me on this analysis. Okay, why do I have a picture of a person here? We're at a research conference. I know you're all data geeks like me and you want to see the data, but My guess is a lot of you share the bias that I have, which is that the data is only important insofar as it affects people's lives. And the reason I'm a policy advocate is because I think that when we use good data to inform policy, we can really affect people's lives at a significant level. And so I like to start with this picture just as a simple reminder. So why did we do this project? This was an analysis of a subset of PIAAC data to really drill down into service sector roles, that is to say entry-level jobs in retail, hospitality, and healthcare, and identify employer interventions that could support the upskilling of these workers and the policy levers that can do that. I'm going to talk today about the data analysis and the PIAAC research. If you want to dig deeper into the examples of the program models for upskilling these kinds of workers and the policies that can enable them, I'll point you towards our full report. So who do we look at, right? The subset of folks we looked at in the PIAAC data, those who are working age, so 16 to 64, currently employed. We picked 3 subsectors of the service sector to look at: retail, accommodations and food service, and health and social work. Non-high skill occupations, this is just our sort of phrase for the fact that while PIAAC sort of has 4 different occupational categories, we looked at the 3 lower of the 4 categories. So if you were in an occupation that was sort of classed as the level that would be akin to a doctor or a lawyer, we excluded you from our analysis. And we looked at folks who performed at level 2 or below on literacy or numeracy in PIAAC, or level 1 or below for PS-TREE or problem solving in technology-rich environments. All the rest of the data that I'm about to show you refers to people who scored low on the literacy skills. But that was statistically indistinguishable from the findings that we had when we analyzed by the other variables, particularly with regard to numeracy. There were a couple of tiny differences with PS-TREE, but nothing interesting enough to report. So what's the overview? The first takeaway is that low skills are prevalent. And I want to caveat this by saying, and this is another reason I started with that picture of a person, I'm very passionate about not underestimating what we call low-skilled adults. Because people are bad at one thing does not mean that they're not capable of holding down a job or coming up with really elaborate coping mechanisms to compensate for the fact that they have skills that aren't so strong in one area, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We also saw that there was pretty diverse distribution across the age range, and the reason this matters is because sometimes people will sort of dismiss this data by saying, well, this is a problem with folks who are about to age out of the workforce, they're about to retire, or conversely, oh, this is a problem of 16 to 24-year-olds and they're still in school and they're still acquiring their skills. That's really not the case. This is spread across the workforce, and so we can't explain this away by simply pointing at folks' age. It's also diverse with regard to race and ethnicity. You can sort of see the breakout of the major race and ethnicity categories here. A plurality were white at 46%, 1 in 5 African American, 1 in 4 Hispanic, and then smaller percentages of Asian American and Pacific Islander or other. About a quarter of these folks are foreign-born. PIAAC doesn't ask about immigration status in any level of detail, so we don't have that data. This is a little sobering. 2/3 of these folks have a high school diploma or equivalent. So this is really a verdict on both the quality of K-12 education that people may have received or the quality of the high school equivalency process they may have gone through, and potentially the length of time since they've been out of school, right? So this is a really sobering slide for those of us in adult education. And this is a kind of double-edged sword of a slide here. This slide shows that 58%, so we're combining both the yellow bar, the blue bar and the green bar, 58% of low-skilled workers have been at their current employer for more than 3 years. So the good news is they're loyal. The bad news is they might be stuck, right? Because in America, traditionally, the way you advance is by changing jobs. And if they're not changing jobs, they might be kind of stuck, and that's a problem. We looked at, PIAAC has this lovely list of variables around whether people are using very specific skills on the job. And we looked at whether people reported using those skills on the job at least once a week, and oftentimes at least daily. And you can see that ranging from 1/3 to 3/4 of the low-skilled adults that we looked at nonetheless reported that they had to use these skills on the job, right? And when we probed deeper in some key informant interviews that we did as an adjunct to the report, we found that people have pretty good coping mechanisms, right? Those coping mechanisms are things like, I forgot my reading glasses, or I'm going to take this memo home to read tonight, and what they mean is I'm going to take it and have my older child or my spouse read it to me. Or they memorize maps and directions because they can't actually read the directions they're being given to get to the job site. The good news is that they have these elaborate coping mechanisms. The bad news is that those coping mechanisms are an invisible drag on their productivity and their ability to sort of navigate throughout their careers and in the workplace. And folks are not stagnating, right? We looked at how many people reported that they are continuing to learn new things on the job. So the important part here is the red and orange part on the right-hand side of the screen. 1/3 of people say they're learning new things every day on the job, and another 23% say they're learning new things at least once a week, right? So maybe they're stuck in their jobs. We don't really know that for sure one way or the other, but they are at least continuing to learn, and they're continuing to teach, right? So again, if you look at the red and the orange on the right-hand side of the chart, well over, well, not almost half of folks are reporting that they are teaching skills on the job to other people at least once a week, and in many cases more often than that. And this is a really notable point. If you don't remember anything else from the data flow, I hope you remember this one. 1 in 4 low-skilled adults are supervising other people, right? And half the time, and we found this out in our key informant interviews too, their own supervisors don't even know that they may lack literacy skills until they get promoted, and then suddenly it's like, well, Amanda is not doing a good job of doing her evaluations of her team members. Why is that? Oh, it's because Amanda can't read well enough to complete this elaborate online system that we have for evaluating Amanda's team members at Rite Aid or Marriott or whatever. And so I think that's really important. The numbers here just show how many of the folks who are supervisors, half of them are supervising 6 or more people. So they're not just supervising one person. And I think that just really speaks to the fact that in the service sector, you have a lot of folks who get promoted because maybe they've got great customer service skills, maybe they've got great dependability, maybe they've got other skills, but they may not have what we consider to be sort of core competent foundational skills that would really allow them to progress in the workforce. About 27% of folks reported that they had pursued some kind of formal education within the past 12 months. And of those who had pursued it, about half were pursuing high school equivalency. So again, it's not that folks don't recognize that they have some basic skills gaps, right? People are clearly pursuing credentials that would help them overcome some of the gaps, but only 1/4 of folks were actually able to be pursuing upskilling. And when we looked at why they didn't, I have a long chart that I didn't put in here for time's sake that sort of boils down to time and money, right? Why didn't you pursue upskilling opportunities? It wasn't close to my job, it cost too much money, I didn't have childcare, I didn't have transportation, all of the reasons that we know. But most of the time when people are pursuing formal education or upskilling, it's because they want to get a better job or earn more money, right? Overwhelmingly, at least 2/3 of folks said it's job-related reasons, but not necessarily their current job. So those were the big findings. I want to end with a couple of very quick takeaways for folks who work in education. So if you are engaging with folks who are practitioners at the classroom level or the program level, this is really simple and obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning. Learners are workers and workers are learners, right? The adult learners who are sitting in our classrooms learning English, studying for their high school equivalency, they are holding down jobs, right? In many, many cases, probably about 60 to 68% of them, depending on which program you're looking at and the sort of demographics of that particular pool. And they're often pursuing the education. They're in your classroom because they have career goals. And their skill gaps are an invisible drag on their productivity at their current job and their ability to sort of navigate through the workforce. For researchers, we have some really interesting, outstanding questions, right? One is we just don't know enough about how these skill gaps and the costs of the coping mechanisms are affecting people's ability to advance in the workforce. It's a gap in the data, right? Maybe there are interesting ways to look at PIAAC data that could help us think about that. Maybe there are ways to combine PIAAC with some other data sets to help us think about that. And then back to the earlier question of we don't know the extent to which low skills are keeping people stuck or the extent to which lower skilled workers are more loyal. And we heard this from the discussant on the prior panel where we talked about sometimes employers are reluctant to invest in lower skilled workers because they think they're going to just leave if they get more skills. That's a really interesting point and worthy of longer discussion. Again, if you want to dig deeper into the policy angle on all of this, I invite you to take a look at the Foundational Skills in the Service Sector report, which I know is available on the website for all of you who are here today. And of course, it's on National Skills Coalition's website too. I want to end with another person. This is a lovely story we heard from one of our key informants during the study, talking about somebody who was a highly skilled employee but a non-reader, and he couldn't get promoted at his job until he came to adult education, where he learned both the accommodations he needed and built his basic skills to the point where he, in fact, could be promoted. And that's the world that this research is pointing to. How do we help people get the tools so that when they have goals for advancing themselves and their families economically, they can pursue those goals without being held back by their skill gaps? Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start with a very quick caveat. The comments that I'm about to make are my own and don't reflect the positions of the Department of Education or NCES. Throw that out there. All right, so I wanted to start with the big takeaway that I got from both of these papers combined, and that is that adults who have low levels of skills might not be the adults that you think they are. So although it's true that adults from certain groups, like those with lower education, tend to have lower skills than those with higher education, older adults, adults who are members of minority groups, and adults who are immigrants, it turns out that most of the adults who have low skills, as we just saw, have a high school credential. Plurality of them are white. Most of them are native born. So this isn't a problem that exists on the margins of American society or with people who are just traditionally disadvantaged. This is really a mainstream America problem. And I think both papers do a really good job of hitting on that point, and it's an important point to make. All right, so turning to the digital literacy paper. So this paper does point out what I just said, that people who are not digitally literate tend to come from certain groups, lower education, older, minority, foreign-born, and they work in low-skilled jobs. No surprise there, right? But it's important to document that. Even though it might seem like a duh finding, we need to know that, in fact, what you expect might be true is in fact true. So I think it's important to get that shown empirically rather than just assuming that it's true. And it also shows that these groups of people we've seen also are the people who tend to be lower on literacy, also on numeracy. So it shows that there's a real multiplicity of disadvantages that certain groups face. Another important point. All right, so how could we expand on the work that they did in that paper? A couple ways in terms of additional characteristics that I would have liked to have seen that I'm hoping maybe somebody else can look at. Earnings. So based on what we see in the paper, I assume that adults who are not digitally literate would have lower earnings than adults who are digitally literate. But we need to see that, right? We've got to have the evidence. And it would be interesting to see how much less they earn. Also, it's probably true that if you don't have digital literacy, it's going to be harder for you to be in a supervisory position. I'd like to see evidence on that as well. And then another way that the work could be expanded would be to move beyond that descriptive approach and do a multivariate analysis to see what's driving what in all of these interrelationships that we see. So, for example, The paper found that 41% of adults who do not have a high school diploma are not digitally literate. 41%. That's a pretty big proportion. What's driving that huge proportion? What would we see if we controlled for things like age and immigration status, which might be part of that 41%? So that would be a nice addition as well. And then, so as Saida kind of alluded to, it was a pleasant surprise to see that when you look at digital literacy internationally, the US scored above average. That's the first time any of us have seen us scoring above average on any PIAAC measure. Yay! But so what that made me think about was, well, okay, so the digital problem-solving assessment excludes these people. And we score below average there. Well, what if we put these people into the digital problem-solving assessment? That seems to make sense to me. These people would score, we could say that they score at the lowest level on digital problem-solving because they can't even use a computer. If you put those people in there, maybe we'd be above average on digital problem-solving. Or maybe we'd at least be average. I'd settle for average. That would be good. So I'd love to see somebody do that. Okay, turning to the paper on low-skilled adults in the service sector. So we've got the service sector, which we know is a large and growing part of the economy, but it pays really low. And then we've got this unfortunately large component of the American population that seems to have a low level of skills. This paper does a nice job of looking at the intersection of those two problem areas, focusing on low-skilled adults in these low-paying jobs. So that's a nice group to look at. The paper also does a really nice job, I think, of using quantitative and qualitative information, which I love studies that do that, and I think more studies should do that. I really enjoyed seeing that, providing a richer analysis by doing that combination. How could we expand on the work that was done in that paper? So this paper, for obvious reasons, they focused on the service sector. That was their interest. But I would like to see this different sectors of the economy compared. And one sector that I think would be interesting to look at is manufacturing, because we think there are a lot of low-skilled people in manufacturing, but that's a sector of the economy where pay tends to be higher. So what proportion of low-skilled workers are in those relatively high-paying jobs versus in these low-paying service jobs? I'd like to see that. They did include healthcare in there. I'd like to see healthcare pulled out and looked at separately, because healthcare and to some extent also IT, those are both fields that tend to have occupations that run a wide gamut of skill levels, wide gamut of income levels. So it'd be interesting to see those sectors of the economy compared to most of the rest of the service sector, which tends to be kind of flat. You're either down at the bottom of the service sector or you're in a management position and there's not much room in between there. And also in healthcare, you've got occupations like nursing, which have lots of stepping stones. So you can go from being a nurse's aide all the way up to a registered nurse through various steps. And in IT, a nice thing that you can have there is you can improve your skills not through the formal education system, but through a series of certifications. There's a lot of certification routes in IT. So how do low-skilled workers sort of navigate through each of those different kinds of systems? And, you know, so I use the word navigate there. I would love to have longitudinal data to follow these low-skilled workers as they stay in the labor force. Hopefully they stay in the labor force. And see what happens to them, how they move through different occupations, how their skills grow or don't grow. In the US, we don't have a longitudinal component to PIAAC, and I haven't heard any talk about that happening. We do have high school longitudinal studies. Maybe we could do something there. And then also Canada has a longitudinal PIAAC component. Maybe somebody could do something there. So those would be interesting. And then finally, although I did say I do like the fact that they use both quantitative and qualitative data, I think we could probably do some more work, or I'd like to see us do some more work to integrate the qualitative and the quantitative components so that they sort of play off of each other as much as possible. So for example, the PIAAC findings found that low-skilled workers in the service sector do a lot of reading on the job. Well, it'd be nice to know from the qualitative data, what reading are they doing? What kinds of documents are they reading? Which documents do they find they can read, and which ones are the kinds of reading tasks that they're finding to be difficult? That kind of integration, I think, would be really helpful. Okay, so I'm going to end by going a little farther afield than just these two papers and talk about how we communicate PIAAC results. So it used to be a couple decades ago that what we focused on were adults who were illiterate. Now, that's an easy concept to understand. We all know what it means when somebody can't read. And people who can't read know that they're illiterate, right? It's pretty obvious that you're missing out on some skill that other people have. Well, fortunately, I guess now we're not focused so much on adults who are illiterate. We're more focused on adults who have these low literacy levels. But that's a vaguer concept, and it's difficult to explain this concept. I mean, we sort of know about what that means when we look at the PIAAC framework, and we can sort of figure it out ourselves, but explaining that to the general public, that's really hard. It's really hard to get people excited about the fact that somebody scores below level 2, and that means you can't do blah, 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 blah. You don't get a good soundbite there. You can't get a good tweet out of that. So we've got a little communication problem, I think, because we've got these vaguer concepts to try to explain to people. So it'd be nice if we could come up with some simpler way to get at what we're finding here if we want to get the public's attention. All right, so now I'm going to go out even further on this limb. So I've seen a lot of PIAAC research that has found that the findings look the same no matter what outcome you look at. Literacy, numeracy, problem solving in digital environment. The second paper found that as well, right? Pretty common. So maybe what we should be talking about here is how difficult it is for adults to deal with complexity in any form. Literacy, numeracy, using a computer. The problem that people are having is they cannot deal with complicated, complex tasks. I don't know if that's going to be any easier to communicate to people, but it seems like it's a concept that has relevance and might resonate better with people in today's world. So that's it. Thank you.